So next thing is going to be just getting the clutch fork on. So there's a little groove right in here that the pivot kind of sits in. It should snap in place so it doesn't allow it to move too much. YouTube, how's it going? And welcome back to AJ's Garage. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you're new to the channel, this is my 1974 F350. And for the better part of 2 years now, I have been trying to complete a 4-speed swap. Now the swap is done. Normally with introductions, they start at the beginning of a project, do a quick overview, and then get right into it. This comes at the end. I ran into a little bit of an issue, went to crank the engine over just to make sure everything was moving freely, cranked for a few seconds, and then it stopped. After a little bit of research, possibility that the ARP bolts that I got for the flywheel might be just a little bit too long. So I'm gonna pull off the inspection cover and take a look and show you guys if that's the problem. Of course, if they're too long, we'll have to pull everything out, trim them up a little bit, and then put everything back together. But like I said, the swap is done, so you guys will get to see that process and what it took to get everything in the truck. Hopefully, if you guys are doing this at home, this helps you guys out. So now let's take a look and see what's going on. So looking at the crank here, it is going to be pretty difficult to see if the bolts are making any type of contact. The dust cover here is in the way, and even if it wasn't, it would probably still be pretty difficult. One thing I did find a little interesting is the starter is still engaged. So I did see that these 4-speed trucks should have a different starter, so possibly I will pick up a new one and see if that does anything. But I guess my recommendation would be, once you get your flywheel torqued down, just make sure everything spins freely. I probably will pull this all apart just to make sure the bolts are not making contact, or at least I'll trim them down a little bit and then put everything back together. I'll leave an update in the comments for you guys. So starting with the pedal assembly, you guys might be able to see that it's already in place there, or at least slightly in place. There are 6 main bolts that secure it up to the firewall. The bottom 4 are actually quite a bit longer than the top 2. And reason being is those also support your brake booster and your brake booster bracket. I got mine powder coated. So those are a little bit longer, I would imagine, just to be able to support the pedal movement for your brakes. Try to show you guys that. The one on the left here is for the top, and this one goes on the bottom. As far as the assembly, on the inside of the cab, there are 2 bolts that secure it there to this part that comes off of the firewall. So I started those just to support it. It's kind of in place, but that should make it a lot easier to get the other 6 secured. So now that the pedal assembly is in and secure, the next step is going to be the steering column. So with the steering column, I believe you technically could leave the automatic column. I happened to come across the column that I have at the junkyard and ended up rebuilding it. If you guys want to check that video out, I'll put a link in the description. But I didn't want to just leave the collar for the automatic column with that shifter location in place. That would have kind of bugged me. So as far as getting this in place, of course, you want to get it down to the, if I can get this kind of held up here in the right orientation, down to the steering gearbox, which will be a little bit difficult. So it's been a few days since I got the pedal assembly back in the truck, and the issue that I ran into with the steering column was that the steering shaft was way too long and the alignment up here was just way off. There was no way I was going to be able to get the column in. But luckily I just pulled the shaft out of the automatic column that was in the truck and then swapped it into this column, and I've already got the rag joint down on the steering gearbox. It should make it a little easier to go in. Now, I can't remember specifically if the truck I pulled this 4-speed column out of was a power steering truck or a manual steering truck, which I believe would cause the difference in the steering shaft length. So luckily, I was just able to swap it. So this is somewhat in place. Can probably just get these started and then make sure everything is seated down at the steering gearbox, and then we'll get this secure. I ended up just using some painter's tape to kind of keep that gasket at the firewall, or the gasket that goes up to the firewall, secure to that bracket here. So we'll make sure that the rag joint is completely seated. Then we'll tighten these up and connect everything down here. So the steering column is in place and secured, and now I'm just trying to get this seal up to the firewall secure. The truck was missing this hardware, and luckily I was able to find this set on eBay, which saved me some time. So just getting this tightened down, getting them all started. And then we'll move on to the gauges. All right, so wraps up the interior of the steering wheel. I'm doing a little bit of work on, so I'm not going to get that on at the moment, but truck is starting to come back together. The interior is done, so now we need to move underneath and start with the transmission. Getting to the underside of the truck, the first thing we need to do is install the pilot bearing. Now this just helps locate the transmission up to the engine. The clutch kit from LMC Truck does come with a few different sizes, so this is the right size that I need. So what you're going to want to do is just try to get it started there. And usually if you can find a socket that fits this outer diameter, you'll use the socket and hammer it in, but I don't have a socket quite big enough, so what I'm going to do is just use a piece of wood. We're going to try to tap that in just so that we don't damage. Damage the bearing, and that's going in nice and even. So now that I've got the pilot bearing installed, next step is installing the flywheel. Now, prior to installation, I'm going to mock everything up here on my bench just to make sure that everything lines up correctly. This is a bit heavy along with everything to do with the clutch, so I want to kind of just line everything up, make sure everything fits well prior to getting underneath the truck and installing it. So what I'm going to do here is just kind of line everything up. This flywheel I ordered off of Summit. I will include part numbers in the description. I believe it is drilled for an 11-inch clutch, which is what I have from LMC, and a 11.5-inch clutch also, which I believe might be a 12-inch, I'm not sure. So it looks like that's lining up right where I need it to. As far as hardware goes, I went with ARP. These do have a little bit of a chamfer, I'm not sure what you would call that, and then the washers have a place for that to sit in, so you want to make sure you get those in the correct orientation. But for now, I'm just making sure everything threads in smoothly and lines up. And then of course, once we get it on the truck, we'll use the alignment tool and get everything torqued down to spec. Drop the bolt. But one last thing too, mark your flywheel. You can always take some brake clean and clean that off after, but this only goes on in one orientation, and that way you're not struggling to remember how this lines up. We'll just line all those up and then get everything torqued down. So one important step before you get the flywheel up is do not forget to install the dust cover. Should have the two locating dowels, and that should just sit in place. Now let's see if I can get this up. Now it's just resting there. And like I mentioned, this only goes on in one orientation. So even though it seems like this might line up, these are all off. So I had a little bit of a difficult time getting it to line up whenever it was really close. In this orientation, some of the holes still look slightly off, but what I decided to do was just start all 6 bolts, and they all thread in very easily. So this is the correct orientation. So what I'm going to do is just tighten these 2 down just very lightly, and then we'll start with these 4 and we'll torque those. I'm going to start with 25 foot-pounds. We'll go up to 45 foot-pounds, and then 75 foot-pounds will be the final torque spec for this. So we're going to use some blue thread locker on the threads, and then we'll use the ARP fastener assembly lubricant for the torque spec right up here by the head. So that should get us an accurate torque spec, and we'll get these all tightened down. This is getting a little messy under here. So when you're torquing these down, you want to go in a crisscross pattern, so directly opposite each other. So we're going to start at the top here. Now I set this to 30 foot-pounds. Alrighty, so all 6 are now torqued to 30 foot-pounds. So we'll probably move up to 50, and then from there 75. So this will be final torque setting of 75 foot-pounds, and we're going to go in the same pattern that we did the other 2 values in. So starting here at the top. So now that the flywheel is installed and torqued to spec, next thing you want to do is make sure that you clean your flywheel surface. Sometimes they can come with an oily residue on them, but you just want to make sure you clean it so that it doesn't cause any slipping or any issues down the road, and then you have to pull everything back out. So we're just going to use some brake clean. Just give it a good clean. So when you're installing this pressure plate, there's only one way it can go, and that is the flat side facing the flywheel. This basket side, I believe is what it's referred to, will go out and face the clutch. So we're going to use our alignment tool. Get that seated, and now we will grab the clutch. And of course we've got our marks here to line it up, so that should be a little easier to get it started. So going to do my best here to get this all lined up. And try and get some of these started. So there, I've got the bottom two started. Should be able to get the top one in. So that wraps up the installation of the flywheel and the clutch kit. I've got everything torqued to spec. Very happy with how it came together. Really wasn't too difficult. Just lining up the flywheel at first was, didn't seem like it was lining up correctly, but was able to figure that out. Now I'm going to move on to the belt housing. We'll get that mated up to the transmission, and while the transmission's out, I'm going to change the gear oil, and then we'll get it put in the truck. So I took a little break from working on the truck, and I was just trying to figure out what would be the simplest way to get everything installed. And I think that's going to be getting the bell housing installed separate. So going over this, you guys might have noticed that I've gotten quite a few things powder coated. Not something that's necessary at all. I just had the time, so got part of this powder coated. Bell housing is powder coated. But as far as the bell housing goes, I've replaced the clutch fork pivot, or the pivot for the clutch fork. The other one was really sloppy, so I was able to order this from LMC, and that's already installed. So next thing is going to be just getting the clutch fork on. So there's a little groove right in here that the pivot kind of sits in. It should snap in place, so it doesn't allow it to move too much. So that little black clip will go in, and you can see that's how it'll pivot. Now I do just need to get this boot on. This of course will protect stuff from going in the bell housing. So with the protective boot on, you guys can see my idea with only getting half of this powder coated. So now that we've got that set, just need to install the throwout bearing. So I did kind of top this off with grease a little bit. but this will just use these two clips here and it'll clip into the back of this. You can kind of see the wear marks. So that's pretty much centered. So that's all ready to go in the truck. So it's a new day and the T19 is ready to go back in the truck. I was able to drain out all the fluid yesterday. It did have some weird kind of like milky colored oil down at the bottom. I cleaned that out as best as possible and then changed all the seals. T19s have two PTO axis covers, one on each side. So I changed the gasket on that and then the gasket on the top cover here. I did use a really light skim coat of high torque RTV just to kind of get everything to stick in place, but I've torqued everything down to 25 foot-pounds. Everything is set, and then of course I filled it up with oil. But the last thing you will need to change on this is the transmission crossmember mount. I'll also include a part number in the description, but this will fit your bump side and dent side trucks. You can see it's relatively narrow. Not sure how well you'll be able to see this, but the stock T19, which this fit bullnose trucks, I believe, is a lot wider and it's got a different mounting style. So we're gonna get that swapped out and I'll show you here in a second how much wider this mount is. I've got the transmission on this jack that should make it a lot easier to get it up in place. The only thing is it might be a little difficult to get it underneath the truck, but we'll probably tilt it on its side and try to get it in place. But as you guys can see, this mount is a lot beefier, just a lot bulkier in general. And then comparing it to the correct size mount, this is what we need. So I don't really believe the orientation matters. Actually, it does. So these holes are a little offset. Let me figure that out real quick. So I'll explain this in a second, but the transmission is in the truck. It was a little bit of a challenge getting everything to line up and in place, but it is in finally. One of the difficulties I have when recording videos is trying to get the best angle for you guys to see what's going on and how it can maybe help you in your projects. But this was just one of those times where it did not really have a good angle. The space was very limited, so I'm just going to kind of go over it. I did slide the transmission up under the back half of the frame here while it was still on the transmission jack. And then I did have to lift the back half of the truck up just a little bit for it to clear the carrier bearing with the top cover on. So I was able to kind of slide it forward. And once I got it up in place, I started to jack it up, and then I had to remove this. It just wasn't allowing it to go up as high as it needed to. And then trying to get it forward through the throwout bearing was kind of difficult. If I had to do it again, I would probably hook up all the pivot stuff, the Z-bar, so that has some pressure on it, because without that, that was just kind of moving all over the place. So I had to hold that as I tried to get the input shaft to line up. But I was able to get it in, got it real close, and then just use the bolts to pull it forward. And then the speedometer cable is hooked up. The cross member is all tidied up and bolted down. One thing that did not work, or I had to change out, was the rear transmission mount. Even though this is supposed to fit, and it says it fits 67 through 79 or 78, this portion down here did not go down far enough to line up with the cross member. So this was the one that was actually on the C6. Thankfully, I still had that. I've been meaning to just trash it, but I was able to pull that off, get that installed. So now I've just got to get the cover back on. And as to why the driver's side of the truck is apart, trying to be as clear as possible with all the linkage and the clutch fork and the pivot stuff on this side. So we've just got to get that installed. All that stuff's ready to go, and I'll show you guys how that goes together. So the first piece that I'm going to be installing is this bracket, which the Z-bar pivots on, and this goes to the engine, which is a 390 FE. And if you guys are doing this swap, this is probably going to be the most difficult piece to find. These are not reproduced. I have found a few. I think I have one other one that's got some bad wear on this pivot here, but this one came off of the parts truck that I got the bell housing off of. And as you guys can see, this is nicely powder coated. But I do have a new felt washer on here, and all this is new from LMC. I'll show you guys how to get that on when I put the frame side pivot. For now, this was just way easier to get it installed like this. The 2 bolt holes are right up in here. I'll include a picture. Let's see, hopefully I can get all this to line up. I did chase the threads, so these are all cleaned out. I just imagine over the years of just being opened, they had a little bit of gunk and grime in there, so those threads are all clean. And of course, these are the bolts too, so this is original hardware. Let's see. Just trying to get that bottom hole to line up. So the next piece going in is the Z-bar. These are pretty universal, I believe, for all these trucks, bump side and dent sides. This one was off of the parts truck. Did have to do some repair to this. Not sure how well you guys will be able to see that, but I did have to apply some weld here and then just ground it smooth. Same thing on this side, kind of had some wear where the hole was closer to one edge than the other, but got that repaired, powder coated, ends are all greased up. So first thing we're going to do is apply the rod, or connect the rod that goes to the clutch fork. Now there are a few different styles of these. This was just what was on the parts truck, so I'm going to go with this. This does come off. It is adjustable in length, so we'll figure that out once we get there, but for now just going to leave it like this. So this takes a washer and a cotter pin. So now we'll get this end prepared. This has a little plastic bushing, I guess. So that goes in like so. And that'll go to the rod from the clutch pedal assembly right over here. Sorry, you guys aren't going to be able to see that. So we'll just get that over the washer there and get that lined up. So that's kind of holding itself up there. And then that also takes a small little cotter pin. So I've switched angles here so you guys can get a better view of this hopefully, but that's where we're at so far. So the last piece to go in is the pivot bracket for the frame side. You should be able to see 2 holes there, and that's how it should kind of line up as such. But first we just need to get the felt washer on. So that kind of slides on like so. The PVC bushing, and then the C-clip holds that all together. And now that's all ready to go. So that looks pretty good there. Hopefully this speedometer cable doesn't really interfere there with anything, or else I'll have to kind of relocate that. And don't mind the greasy, leaking power steering gear. I do plan on rebuilding that once we get to the brakes. So new hardware. Seems like the frame is threaded there. Might make it a little easier to get in. So having those threaded made that a lot easier. They did come with some nuts for the backside, but I'm glad that was not necessary, because just kind of looking at how this is all set up, it probably would have been real difficult to get those tightened down, but that is definitely very secure. Now let's see if pressing on the clutch, everything works as it should. So now that I've verified that everything with the clutch and the pedal assembly seems to be functioning correctly, at least up until I take it on its first test drive, I might have to make a small minor adjustment. But moving on to the last few things that I need to finish up this swap, one of those being the drive shafts. This one at the back here is the one that came out of the truck. The F350 is a cab and chassis truck, so this would be a longer drive shaft than what would come on your standard F250. The wheelbase on the dually is 137 inches, whereas I believe for F250s it's 133 or 34. So this is a longer drive shaft. I did replace the U-joint on this. The slip yoke seems fine. I do have a new cap for this as well. Another piece that is slightly different, your intermediate drive shaft is a different length compared to the one that was out of the truck from the C6. So this is off of the parts truck that I got the bell housing and a few other things off of. I got the carrier bearing replaced. I was able to kind of cut off the old one, just made cuts at an angle like this as to not damage any of the drive shaft. Was able to kind of peel the pieces off, and then the inner sleeve, I just took my Dremel and made a cut, just being very careful not to cut through. But once it got thin enough, I was able to kind of crack it open and pull it off without damaging any of the slip yoke portion here. And then I did, of course, replace this U-joint. This is the one that goes to the transmission, so that is correct for the T19. That, of course, is going to vary per your application, but I will include the part numbers for this U-joint and the one on this drive shaft in the description. Drive shafts are back in the truck, and the last step to complete the swap is putting the shifter back into the transmission. If you guys are familiar with bullnose style trucks, which is what the T19 came out of, the shift rod on those trucks is really, really bulky, especially down here at the bottom. The diameter is a lot thicker than this as well, so it wouldn't have accepted this style shift knob, and it wouldn't have fit through the shift boot. I would have had to cut that, and did not want to do that. I want this to look pretty much original, as if it was a T18. So I ordered this off of the Novak website. This is a 24-inch shift rod. I believe they also sell an 18-inch. Novak has a lot of things for conversions, transfer cases, all kinds of stuff, but obviously T18 and T19s as well. The only thing I did have to do is measure the depth from the top cover, so I was able to take this piece, and as you guys can see, that matches up exactly, so this will work. So last step is going to be just getting it bent up. I'm just going to match this bend first. We'll give it a test and see how that feels. Once I get it bent how I want it, this of course will get powder coated, and that'll wrap up the swap. So whenever you're reinstalling the shifter or removing it, you always want to make sure the transmission is in neutral. And you definitely want to be careful not to lose that little dowel pin. Drop the spring in place. this top cover, and then this is what applies pressure. And it can be a little difficult to get started because that spring wants to push up on it. So you got to push down and then try to get the threads to line up. So we're just going to get the shift knob on, and we'll give this thing a test. All right. So we got first, clears the dash pretty well. It's got some good spacing. Second, not too bad. Third, and fourth. What I like about that is it's not too close to the seat. I'm kind of tall. I'm 6'5", so as far as it being a little higher, that helps out. No problem reaching way up to the dash, so I'm happy with that. I think I'm going to leave that alone. I'm probably not going to add another bend here, but we'll get the dust boot on, or the boot on there. I will get this powder coated at a later time, but that pretty much wraps up the swap. Next video is going to be tidying up a few things in the engine bay. I'm going to do an oil change, replace the fuel pump. We'll get some gas in this thing and go take it for a drive.